For more on this story, we can bring in Carsten Brzeski, Global Head of Macro for ING Research. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. Last year, we had the EU, which effectively rushed to conclude a free trade agreement with Washington. With this new tariff threat from the US president, where does that deal stand?
Well, this deal clearly stands or hangs in the balances because it is up to European Parliament, and the vote was actually scheduled for this week
Hmm.
to sign off the European commitments in this deal between the EU and the US, and therefore this is clearly hanging in the balances. And I think that also Europe will now ask itself, how reliable is the US still when doing these agreements?
Donald Trump has singled out several countries, including France, Germany, effectively countries that sent troops to Greenland over the past few days. Can the US single out specific European Union countries and slap tariffs on them, or does it have to work on the bloc as a whole?
Well, in theory, the US could single out individual countries, but in practice, this is very difficult. Because we have one border, we have one custom, so that is practically very hard to do.
Hmm.
But still, if the U.S. administration actually realized that this is very hard to do, who would stop the U.S. administration in imposing additional tariffs for all of the EU?
I know Europe is trying to show that it's united in its response, but is the EU united as a bloc?
That is a good question and a very tricky question. I think with all the comments that we had over the weekend, it looks as if the EU is more united than it was last year. But still, when push comes to shove, the big question is whether the individual governments can actually leave their national interests in trade with the US behind. Because it's obvious that, for example, a country like France is less exposed to trade with the US than a country like Germany. So now this is really up to the European Union to stand as a united front and show limits to the US government. Also, to be very clear, I think Europe would really have to go all in terms of reaction, of trade reaction
Hmm.
to inflict economic harm on the US. Because when you look at trade itself, the EU is more dependent on trade with the US than the other way around.
I wanted to ask you about that because what are some of the tools that the EU could use to respond? France, for instance, wants this anti coercion mechanism instrument triggered. This has never been used, so how would it work exactly?
I think the first thing that we have is still the long list of tariffs that was negotiated already last summer,
Hmm.
but that was never put in use because we got the deal last summer between the EU and the US. These suspended measures will or could become effective if nothing is done by February. So that is the number of close to 100 billion euro tariffs from the EU on US goods. Then we have, like you mentioned, the anti-coercion tool that is something that has never been used before. It is called or known as the trade bazooka. We don't know how it's going to work. We only know that it gives the European Commission all freedom to either come up with counter tariffs, to limit investments in Europe, to also go for export controls, or to even intervene in intellectual property. I think, if you summarize all these things, if Europe was really to try to inflict economic harm on the US, Europe would have to go for tariffs on digital services, because when you look at the trade balance on goods, it is clearly in the favor of the US, meaning that the EU exports more to the US than the other way around.
Guys,
But when you look at
I
services,
want to jump in very
then
briefly
it
because
is.
the US could also hit back as well. As you said, Europe is a lot more dependent on the US, not in terms of just big tech, but also financial services, things like visa transactions, etc. Could Donald Trump play dirty if he wanted to?
Of course, you could. And I think
Hmm.
this is the biggest risk of the current situation. And this also means that the current situation is much riskier than where we were last summer. Because this is also not only about trade, it is actually putting enormous unknown stress on the transatlantic relationship, probably the worst or the most challenging situation for the transatlantic relationship since the end of World War II. Because if we don't watch out, we're really in the midst of an escalating spiral with a tit for tat, and then there is no end to how much harm each party or each side could do to the other side. And also, remind you, there are no winners in trade wars. Trade wars only know losers.
We're in real uncharted territory here. Carsten Brzeski, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today.